After graduating from Purdue University with a Bachelor of Science degree in 1978, David embarked upon a 37-year career in forensic science and identification, working in the Technical Services Division of the Fort Wayne Police Department and the Indiana State Police Laboratory in Fort Wayne, before joining the Indianapolis-Marion County Forensic Services Agency as a forensic scientist specializing in latent print examination. He served there for more than 27 years before retiring in 2015. He's been an adjunct instructor in the Forensic and Investigative Sciences program at IU Indianapolis and a guest lecturer at the University of Indianapolis. He's a longtime member of the Illustrious Clients of Indianapolis, a Sherlock Holmes Literary Society, and I'm sure he's happy to tell you all about that if you want to join. I know he brought some flyers that are on the table out here. And as of 2015, when he retired, we have been very fortunate to see him around here quite a bit because in his retirement, he is now a docent here at the museum and a collections assistant working with artifacts and also a board member. So he's around quite a bit. So please help me welcome the Zauner. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. I appreciate it. I will now call this meeting of the illustrious clients to order.
Hey, there's Star Trek.
An intersection of universes. So, I've been a longtime reader of the Sherlock Holmes stories, but when I started working in the forensic science profession, they took on even more meaning because as I read the stories, I realized that Holmes's methods did reflect what was capable in forensic science at the time. And so I've kind of put together this presentation and a longer article that show how he really does follow the methods of science. He was the first detective who's explicitly used science in his investigations. It's especially appropriate, I think, that I'm giving this in this place tonight because this building dates from the era of Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle and Dr. John Watson would be at home in the laboratories here because the equipment here is the same that they would have used in their examinations. So we are in the time of Sherlock Holmes. Unfortunately, not Victorian England, we're in America, but still, he would have been familiar with what goes on here. So without further ado, I will launch into my talk. So one last thing, if anyone who is not an illustrious client is interested, there are information brochures and membership applications on the table in the Anatomical Museum right next door here. So you're welcome to take any of those that you might be interested in. Okay. So in this modern era, CSI television programs are commonplace, and sophisticated technologies such as DNA profiling and fingerprint databases are taken for granted. But just over a century ago, things were much different. In the late 19th century, the application of science to the investigation of crimes was in its infancy. The specialized fields of study, now known as collectively as the forensic sciences, had just barely begun to emerge, and crime laboratories did not yet exist. This was a time of rapid advances in science and technology. Railways, telegraphy, and the discovery of the germ theory of disease had revolutionized transportation, communication, and medicine. And in England and continental Europe, there was growing sentiment in favor of trying to apply some of these advances to social programs, including crime control. It was in this context that the British reading public was introduced in 1887 to a new character with a much different approach to detection than his predecessors, Mr. Sherlock Holmes of 221B Baker Street, London. The very first recorded words of Holmes in the first published novel, A Study in Scarlet, exemplified his approach. I found it. I found it. I found a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin and by nothing else. Holmes looked at detection as a scientific inquiry in which logical deductions were made from established facts and careful observations of minute clues. In the 60 published Sherlock Holmes stories, fingerprints, footprints, handwriting, bloodstains, and chemical analyses were mentioned numerous times. Holmes was able to distinguish between the many varieties of tobacco ash and even wrote a monograph upon that subject. I would give anything to see that monograph. He could recognize the soils from different locales by their color and appearance. His first action upon arriving at the place where a crime had occurred was almost always a thorough examination of the scene and, if there was one, the body, looking for the smallest details, a footmark or a tire track, a bit of mud or a spot of blood, an upturned corner of a carpet or a smudge upon a wall, all without a word about what he thought had happened. And this indicates what Dr. Watson thought was his field of knowledge. It is a capital mistake to theorize in advance of the facts was one of his guiding principles. So let's go to forensic science. Exactly what is it? In brief, it's the application of science to the law. It is a scientific method for associating people, places, and things with one another that may be involved in criminal activities. It assists in investigating and adjudicating criminal cases. It provides information to detectives and the courts. And it is a way to bring science to bear on the questions of culpability in criminal and civil law. And a little bit more poetic, this introduction here from Paul Kirk in his criminal investigation. Everyone leaves a trace wherever he goes, and it's our job to find them, study them, and see what value they have. It is factual evidence. It cannot be changed like human memories can be changed. It exists independently of the observer, and it is only our lack of observation, our lack of collection, our lack of proper understanding of the evidence that diminishes its value. So forensic science includes specialized area of chemistry, biology, and physics applied to the study of soil, hairs, fibers, body fluids, drugs, poisons, documents, firearms, fingerprints, footwear, and tire impressions. Anything that might be used in or left at the scene of a crime. It is related to forensic medicine, also called medical jurisprudence, which is the application of medicine to law. And that field predates forensic science by quite a bit. So at the time of Sherlock Holmes, forensic science was not yet a formally recognized specialty, although medical jurisprudence was. Government forensic laboratories did not exist. Universities, private laboratories, and individuals did examinations when requested. There were limited tools available. There was chemical apparatus, microscopes were used extensively, occasionally spectroscopes, very similar to the instruments that you would find in the Medical History Museum when you come back from the tours. Police and judicial officials were often unfamiliar with ways that science could aid investigations. Scenes were not really properly preserved. Evidence was not collected or examined. The emphasis was on interrogating suspects and extracting confessions. On the European continent, scientific methodology was more advanced than in England or certainly in the United States, because they had more organized police and judicial systems that had been around in a formal sense for quite a bit longer than in England. So some things could be done. Blood could be reliably identified by something called the hematine crystal test, which may be what Holmes was referring to in that exclamation in the first novel, A Study in Scarlet. Human origin could not be determined until the precipitin test was developed in 1901. Blood cells could sometimes be distinguished in fresh samples because the size and shape of the cells differ from animal to animal. Blood typing was still years in the future. Chemical analysis was limited to color tests, precipitation, and crystal tests. The only instrument available really was the spectrograph. Now you'll notice that I have two images up here, crystals of tin bronze alloy and cocaine crystals. Anybody know why those particular ones are up there? Tin bronze alloy was used in counterfeiting, and Holmes did investigate at least one counterfeiting case. And of course, we all, or most of us who have heard of Sherlock Holmes, have heard of his use of the 7% solution of cocaine to excite his brain when there was no case going. Microscopy was very important. There were a lot of things then and now that could be done with a microscope. Dust, soil, hairs and fibers, biological material, all of those lent themselves to microscopic examination. And there are a number of stories in which Holmes used a microscope. Gunsmiths were occasionally used to perform some firearms examination to say whether a particular projectile could have been fired in a pistol or rifle or shotgun that was suspected, but there was no ability yet to specifically identify the firearm that discharged a particular projectile. That examination of microscopic markings was still in the future. Fingerprint identification, my specialty, was in its infancy, but its advantages were being rapidly recognized. So in those early days, there are several people who can be seen as pioneers of forensic science. Alphonse Bertillon, or Bertillon, was a Frenchman, the child of an anthropologist and a mathematician, who got himself a low-level job in the Paris police archives, trying to associate individuals with their criminal records. And he soon realized it was a hopeless task because there was no standardized way of recording descriptions, of associating people. I mean, people could change their names at the drop of a hat. So he worked to come up with a system which he called anthropometry, and was later called Bertillonage in honor of its creator, which relied on measurements of certain bony parts of the body that would not change during adult life, and supplemented by very detailed physical descriptions of scars, marks, and tattoos, also photographs, front face and profile, that could be used to positively identify someone. He also standardized and developed techniques for photographing crime scenes and parts of evidence. His methods of crime scene photography allowed entire scenes to be photographed in such a way that all of the detail was preserved. And if we go back a bit, oh, all right, now the arrows are working. All right. You see the picture there of Monsieur Bertillon? Does that look familiar? Think of what we see on TV nowadays in police mugshots. Yeah. Standard view, you've full face and a profile. Now, the full face was useful in lineups when you're trying to get witnesses to identify someone. Why did he put the profile? It changes. Exactly. The shape of the ear is unique to the individual as well. So this was another identifying feature that was part of anthropometric. And it worked. It identified many recidivists, people with prior criminal records. It identified fugitives, including anarchists wanted for bombings. It was a huge success. Hans Gross of Graz, Austria. In 1893, he published the first comprehensive text on criminalistics, or scientific investigation of crimes. He called it a manual for examining magistrates as a system of criminology. And he used all of the information that he had gathered in his career as an examining magistrate. Now, the continental European system differed from the English and American system, in which the judicial branch got involved in cases very early. In major cases, there would be individuals called examining magistrates or sometimes investigating judges who would help direct major case investigations and collate and correlate all of the information that was developed. And Hans Gross was one of these people, but he had a judicial education, but he had no idea about criminal investigation. None of his judicial training prepared him for this. So he collected what he had learned over his time to put together this first comprehensive manual. He advocated the detailed examination and recording of crime scenes, the use of chemists, biologists, and microscopists for the examination of materials associated with crimes, really bringing science into criminal investigation. Edmond Locard in Lyon, France, founded the very first police scientific laboratory in 1910. He came up with what others had kind of known, but he put it into words as Locard's exchange principle. Very simply, every contact leaves a trace. That is one of the reasons that forensic science exists, to detect those traces and link them back to the individuals. So he put it a little bit more eloquently. It is impossible for a criminal to act, especially considering the intensity of a crime, without leaving traces of his presence. And then finally, again, with my specialty, William Herschel, Henry Faulds, Francis Galton in England were instrumental in coming up with the system for fingerprint identification that we use today. They established the basic principles of fingerprint identification in the 1880s and 90s, the uniqueness of fingerprints to an individual and their persistence through life. Herschel was a British official in India, and he used fingerprints for personal investigation or personal identification for pensioners and for criminals in British India. Faulds was a British physician working in Japan. He was not connected with the government or law enforcement. He was a missionary doctor. But he used fingerprints to identify who was tippling the laboratory alcohol in his office. And from that, he advocated the use of fingerprints for identification at scenes of crime. He also exonerated one of his students who was accused of breaking into part of the hospital by showing that the fingerprints on the window that was open did not match. So not only can they incriminate, they can exonerate. And then Galton, a British anthropologist, studied the formations of fingerprints and established their persistence over time. He had a laboratory where he had a lot of people visiting. And one of the things he did with anybody who was willing, he would record their fingerprints and palm prints every time they visited. So he amassed a collection of many prints from individuals over time and could show that that distance was persistent. So with that as a preamble, let's get into some of Holmes's adventures and how they compare with actual cases. So in A Study in Scarlet, Conan Doyle introduces Holmes's methods through Watson's account of his detailed examination of the crime scene at 3 Lauriston Gardens. So Watson wrote, outside the scene, he proceeded slowly down the path, or rather down the fringe of grass which flanked the path, keeping his eyes riveted upon the ground. He was looking for traces of footprints. Inside, where the body was in the room. As he spoke, he whipped a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket. With these two implements, he trotted noiselessly around the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, and once lying flat upon his face. For 20 minutes or more, he continued his researches, measuring with the most exact care the distance between marks which were entirely invisible to me, and occasionally applying his tape to the walls in an equally incomprehensible manner. Remember, this is Watson talk. In one place, he gathered up very carefully a little pile of gray dust from the floor and packed it away in an envelope. Finally, he examined with his glass the word Rache, R-A-C-H-E, German for revenge, upon the wall, going over every letter of it with the most minute exactness. This done, he appeared to be satisfied, for he replaced his tape and his glass in his pocket. Holmes said, they say that genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains. It's a very bad definition, but it does apply to detective work. And when you think about the care that goes into examining modern crime scenes, the photography, the note-taking, the documenting, collection of evidence, yes. So what did Holmes deduce? There has been murder done, and the murderer was a man. He was more than 6 feet high, was in the prime of his life, had small feet for his height, wore coarse, square-toed boots, and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar. He came here with his victim in a 4-wheeled cab, which was drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and a new one on his off foreleg. In all probability, the murderer had a florid face, and the fingernails of his right hand were remarkably long. Wow. And he was able to do this in spite of a less than ideal preservation of the scene by the Scotland Yard detectives and the police officers, a problem which still persists. So with trace evidence and microscopic examination, in the Holmes adventure of Shoscombe Old Place, in the preliminaries, Holmes is working in his rooms in 221B Baker Street on a case involving the murder of a policeman. He calls it the St. Pancras case. He's talking to Watson. It is glue, Watson. Unquestionably, it is glue. Have a look at these scattered objects in the field. So Watson is now looking through the microscope. Holmes is describing what he's seeing. Those hairs are threads from a tweed coat. The irregular gray masses are dust. There are epithelial scales on the left. Those brown blobs in the center are undoubtedly glue. The accused man denies that it is his, but he is a picture frame maker who habitually handles glue. Again, an incriminating deduction. So, real life use. In Bavaria in 1908, a farm girl named Margareta Filbert was found murdered in a field not far from home. And police had a suspect, a farmer, Andreas Schleicher, who nobody liked because he had a horrendous temper and was generally disagreeable, but there was nothing to connect him to the crime. No witnesses, nothing. So the police inspector at the time, who was familiar with the work of Hans Gross, documented the scene, was able to, on a ruse of accusing Schleicher of poaching, was able to take his boots into custody. And he turned them over to a chemist named Georg Popp from Frankfurt, who did a lot of criminal investigative work. Not only did Popp look at the boots, he followed the most direct path between Schleicher's farmhouse and where the body was found. He collected soil samples. Then he dissected the layers of soil on Schleicher's boots, and he was able to make an exact correspondence between the soil and the plant debris in each layer on that boot, and corresponded exactly to the location where it was found. And as the final straw, if you will, fibers that were spectroscopically identical to the wool of Margareta Filbert's dress were found in that last layer of soil. When he was confronted with this, he confessed. So fingerprints in blood. Holmes addresses that in at least one story, The Adventure of the Norwood Builder. A disagreeable individual named Jonas Oldacre hires a lawyer to prepare his last will and testament, and then tries to frame him for Oldacre's murder by putting a body in a fire and hiding inside his house, thinking that the body will be thought to be his and that his attorney, John Hector McFarlane, will be charged with the crime. He didn't count on Scotland Yard getting Sherlock Holmes involved in the case. So Oldacre faked his death. He planted a fingerprint of McFarlane at the scene, which he did the day after Holmes had been there once. So Holmes, when he came back again, realized this was new. This was not there at the time. Holmes deduced that Oldacre was hiding somewhere in the house. And so he got everybody to rouse a call of fire to smoke Oldacre out and expose the ruse for what it was. The body was, I think, a tradesman who had been shanghaied and murdered by Oldacre. The fingerprint was McFarlane's. It was forged from the wax seal in which McFarlane put his fingerprint as he sealed the will. A real case, Argentina, 1892. Francisca Rojas, in the middle of the night, showed up at a neighbor's house screaming that her children had been killed. The local police chief found them bludgeoned to death in their beds. She put suspicion on a neighbor, and the neighbor, according to the standards of the time, was vigorously interrogated. The interrogation methods included leaving him tied up next to the bodies of the dead children overnight with the thought that he would repent and confess. He did not. He maintained his evidence. The local police chief threw his hands up and said, "I'm calling in the provincial police." The Buenos Aires provincial police inspector happened to be familiar with fingerprints because Juan Vucetich, a South American pioneer of fingerprints, the two of them worked in the same bureau. So the first thing he did when he got there in the daylight was to examine the crime scene again. He found a smudge on the doorpost, which he recognized as a fingerprint through his experience. The neighbor didn't make it, so he fingerprints Rojas. And lo and behold, her right thumb made that print in blood on the doorpost. Again, confronted with this, she confessed. I believe that is the first recorded case in which a fingerprint led to a murder confession. And amazingly enough, her fingerprints are still in the archives of the Buenos Aires police. So we've looked at some older methods of forensic science. What about forensic science today? We have the latest in methods and equipment. In biology, we have DNA profiling and data banks. Chemistry, advanced analytical techniques, fancy instruments, mass spectrometry, scanning electron microscopes. Photography, digital cameras, image processing. There are gadgets now that can map and photograph an entire crime scene at 360 degrees almost automatically. And you can then download that to browse through the scene later. Firearms examination, we have the National Integrated Ballistics Identification Network, which is an automated searching tool that lets you link the microscopic markings on bullets and cartridge cases to guns in the database that maybe were seized in connection with criminal activity, and perhaps link cases to each other to provide leads to investigators. And in fingerprints, we have automated fingerprint identification or searching systems. We also have newer ways to find fingerprints on difficult surfaces, chemical, optical, photographic methods that can work wonders. But we also have challenges to forensic science. There are shrinking resources to deal with growing demand. As people see more of the forensic shows on TV, there are more requests to apply forensic science to crimes. The resources budgets are stagnant, if not being cut. Fewer people to deal with more cases. There are unrealistic expectations about the capabilities of forensic science. Somebody's house gets burgled and they expect a mobile crime lab to show up and spend 3 days finding everything that they can. And it'd be wonderful if we could do that, but there just are not the resources. I mean, you're lucky to spend a couple of days at a homicide scene, much less a burglary or a robbery. Questions have been raised about the validity of some forensic sciences and their conclusions. Fingerprint identification has been challenged in court. Fortunately, the fingerprint profession came together, did the research that was necessary now to establish that, yes, fingerprints are a reliable means of identification, that properly trained and experienced examiners can reliably interpret them. Other specialties have had to do the same, but some have been found not to be valid. Hair examination, it used to be thought you could be very more individualistic in hairs. Now we know that that's just not the case. We still have instances where potentially valuable evidence is not recognized at crime scenes, either due to lack of training, lack of experience, or sometimes just the pressure of casework. If you've got half a dozen cases backed up on your call list, you can't spend a whole bunch of time with each one trying to find whatever evidence is there. It's sad but true. And still, many in the legal profession are unfamiliar with forensic science, despite how often it's used. To my knowledge, there is no requirement for a law degree to take any coursework in forensic science at all, not even an introductory course. Now, hopefully there are lawyers who will get into practice that will take that forward, but you don't need one to get a law degree or a law license. In many ways, forensic science depends on the individuals who practice it. You have to have some natural ability. You have to have patience, an eye for minute detail, the ability to be very meticulous. I like to jokingly say that in my career as forensic science, I developed CDO, which is OCD with the letters in alphabetical order, just like they're supposed to be. You have to supplement that natural ability with education and specialized training. Either a forensic science degree or a degree in something like chemistry and biology that gives you the foundation to go further. And then when you get to your first posting, the laboratory where you start out is responsible for training you in the specific details of the work that you're going to be doing. There are professional organizations that offer seminars and training as well. When I was early in my career, the FBI used to offer courses at Quantico, Virginia, to aid in the development of forensic scientists. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to several of those. They were hugely valuable. You have to be objective. You have to have sound, unbiased judgment. You have to recognize when you might be biased and take pains to avoid it. Their bias can work its way into what you're looking at, and you have to be very conscious of that. Doing things like having somebody else look at what you've concluded. Is it accurate? Is it sufficient? The final and most important quality of a forensic science is integrity and ethics. You have to be a person whose word can be trusted. You have to be ethical. You cannot tell your results to whoever's hiring you. You can't say what someone wants to hear. You have to be objective. And in the words of Sergeant Joe Friday and the old Jack Webb Dragnet series, just the facts, man. If your word cannot be believed, it doesn't matter how good you are at the science, you're worthless. And that, if you will, is the one thing that I have been most disturbed about in forensic science, is those people who will, in essence, sell their soul to advance their career or to get them. They harm the entire profession. They cast a shadow on all of us who are doing it the very best that we can. And I despise those people. End of soapbox. So was Sherlock Holmes the first CSI? And maybe not a bad example for those of us in the profession to follow. But wait, there's more. I've talked a lot about Sherlock Holmes. What about the man who created him? Or in the terms of playing the game, his literary agent. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a trained physician. He was an advocate and he was also a detective. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland from 1876 to 1881. He got his Bachelor of Medicine, Master of Surgery, and Doctor of Medicine degrees there. The course of instruction included medical jurisprudence, forensic medicine, taught by figures well known in the field. He was an outpatient clerk, kind of an intern, in the Royal Infirmary for a Dr. Joseph Bell, who was renowned for his ability to diagnose illness and tell things about his patients just by looking at them before they said a word about what their problem was. His observation skills and his ability to do those things may have been Conan Doyle's inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle was also familiar with not just detective fiction, but real-life investigation. He read the Newgate calendars, which were crime accounts from the 1770s. He read detective stories of Poe and Gaboriau. He read the memoirs of Eugene Vidocq of the Paris Sûreté. He corresponded with Sir Francis Galton and knew the work of Bertillon. He visited Scotland Yard's Black Museum in 1892 to research police procedures. And he knew Bernard Spilsbury, who became perhaps the most famous forensic pathologist in British history. So, scientific investigation. Sherlock Holmes used careful observation, scientific examination, and logical deduction to solve cases. Conan Doyle, through his fictional, Sherlockians, detective, advocated for the official police to use these same methods in a more systematic manner in criminal investigation. Through the Holmes stories, Conan Doyle also exposed his readers to those possibilities, perhaps with the hope that they might exert some influence on their local police through public pressure. And our profession, forensic scientists, may very well owe a debt of gratitude to a fictional detective and his literary agent. Now, shortly after the Holmes stories began appearing in print, Conan Doyle started getting letters from readers addressed to Sherlock Holmes or to Conan Doyle directly, asking, sometimes pleading for help. At first, he mostly ignored them because Sherlock Holmes wasn't his first priority with literature. He was just kind of a side gig to make money as it started out. But later, some of those cases piqued his interest and maybe tugged at his heartstrings a little bit. He undertook some private cases, particularly when he thought there was a miscarriage of justice, and used the methods he ascribed to Holmes in his work. He exonerated at least 2 wrongly convicted individuals, and he looked into other cases. George Adalji was convicted of horse maiming in 1903 in Staffordshire. He was suspected of many more mutilations, even though they continued well after he was in custody. Conan Doyle re-examined the scene of the crime and determined that there was no way that Adalji, who had very poor eyesight, extremely nearsighted, could have performed very delicate mutilations in the dark of night. He couldn't have even got to the place where they happened in the dark of night. His work that revealed that flawed or perhaps fabricated evidence and racial prejudice, Adalji's father was from India, led to a wrongful conviction. Sadly, racism is not something new. It existed quite a few places. And as a result of Conan Doyle's efforts, Adalji received a full pardon. Oscar Slater was convicted of murdering an elderly woman in Glasgow, Scotland, 1908. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life at hard labor. When Conan Doyle looked into it, he uncovered inconsistencies in witness testimony, unexplored leads, and evidence of judicial misconduct. And as a result of his work and public outcry, Slater was pardoned in 1927. He was compensated for the conviction and 19 years imprisonment. And at least in part in response to this case, Scotland finally established a court of criminal appeal, because before this, there was no appeal. The only option was to ask for a pardon. Unfortunately, the murder case was never solved. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, perhaps creator of the first CSI, an advocate for professional criminal investigation, a physician, and a detective. Thank you so much.